they put out a statement saying they felt the need to, quote, express our incomprehension about what the Trump administration had just done. Across the spectrum in the United States, the reaction was the same, and it was unanimous among all sorts of different kinds of people who you might think would otherwise have really different perspectives on this. But across the board, everybody was also incomprehending. The former head of U.S. military operations for that region called the decision by the Trump administration, quote, puzzling. A very different kind of expert, a top human rights lawyer who had operated extensively in that country, called the Trump administration's decision, quote, bewildering, saying there's no reason, and, quote, it makes no sense whatsoever. None. Zero. Longtime U.S. ambassador to the neighboring country said, to me, what they did makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. That same ambassador did have one speculative explanation. He said it was possible the Trump administration did what they did, quote, out of sheer incompetence. But otherwise, frankly, it just doesn't make sense. So across the board, those are all very different types of people who tend to have different types of reactions, right, to policy decisions made by a new administration. But with all these different types of regional experts, they're all just baffled. We have no idea where this came from. And what they were so baffled by had to do with this part of the world, this big belt of countries, belt of big countries that makes up most of the lower tier of the Sahara Desert. The countries we're talking about here are Mali and Nigeria and Niger and Chad. Here in the United States right now, of course, we are suddenly paying a lot of attention to the nation of Niger. 2 American Green Berets, 2 other U.S. Special Forces soldiers were just killed in Niger just over 2 weeks ago. And at a time when most Americans had no idea that we had a significant number of U.S. troops in Niger at all, or if we did, that those troops were at any significant risk, let alone that we might lose 4 of them in an ambush. Turns out we do have several hundred American troops serving in Niger, possibly as many as 1,000, based on what Defense Secretary James Maddow told reporters today. But I think it's helpful just to see that map there, in part to remember which country borders which country, if you're not that familiar with that part of Africa. But also just to remember, these are really large countries we're talking about. Niger, for example, Niger is a former French colony, but in terms of its area, Niger alone is twice the size of France. Mali is about the same size. Chad is even bigger than that. These are large, landlocked countries that have big, long interior borders with each other. And so their regional concerns are really intertwined. By necessity, they end up very mixed up and very involved in each other's business, both for the worse and for the better. And on that map, the country that's just east of Niger, the nation of Chad, that's the country that caused every expert on that region, every expert in the military and the human rights people and the diplomats, everybody, caused them all, even that country's own government, to express just profound surprise and bewilderment just a few weeks ago, last month, when the Trump administration did something really strange about that country that might have actually just been a mistake. Still, to this day, it doesn't make much sense what the Trump administration did. It really might have just been a screw-up by them. But what they did also might explain why we have just had these 4 absolutely unbelievable, gut-wrenching, emotional days in American politics and in D.C. in particular. Because if I were them, I would rather divert attention to anything, even unbelievably unpalatable decisions and discussions, rather than talk about this. All right, do you remember back in 2012, Islamic militants, a militia linked to al-Qaeda, took over Timbuktu? Right, they took over a whole swath. Timbuktu's in Mali. They took over Timbuktu and a whole swath of northern Mali, including that historic, world-famous city. The militants declared Sharia law. They started destroying shrines and tombs, all these priceless World Heritage sites. Mali had been a French colony. France still takes an acute interest and sees itself as a stakeholder in that part of the world. And they took over Timbuktu in 2012. By January 2013, French jets were flying into Mali. France led a big military operation, thousands of troops, to help the government of Mali take back its territory from those militants, to free Timbuktu, to free all those other areas in northern Mali that had been held by the Islamic extremists. They just took back whole swaths of that country from the militant groups. And France went in full force. But they were not there alone. They were in support of the government of Mali, and they were there with a big regional force of African troops, which in some cases had a lot of experience already fighting against these Islamic militias. One of the most critical and effective parts of the African force that fought alongside the French back in 2013 were the special forces and the military more broadly from Chad. When the French and those regional African forces routed the Islamic militants in Timbuktu in northern Mali, the French thereafter decided that they would stay. They set up a regional force to continue to fight Islamic extremists, to keep those extremists from taking territory again in that part of the world. Part of the reason you can tell that Chad in particular had been super valuable to France in that fight is because when France decided to stay, when they decided they'd stay in the region, they'd leave troops there, they'd set up a regional headquarters to run a permanent regional operation against Islamic militancy in that part of the world, where they decided to set their headquarters up was not in Mali, where they had this big fight over Timbuktu and that whole northern part of the country. No, they set up their headquarters in Chad. And that's where they remain today. That French-led operation has been headquartered in Chad since 2014. 2014 is also when President Barack Obama decided to send a contingent of U.S. troops to assist in the hunt for those hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls who were kidnapped and held captive by Boko Haram. U.S. troops were sent in to that part of the world to be part of the fight to look for the Chibok girls, to look for those Nigerian schoolgirls in 2014. And a lot of what the U.S. troops were there to do was just physically to look for the girls, to try to figure out where they were being held. And the place where U.S. troops operated the surveillance drones from and the planes that looked for those girls in that military operation was, again, Chad. The U.S. military, as well, set up their headquarters for that fight in Chad. Then in 2015, another permanent multinational joint task force was set up to fight Islamic militant activity in that whole huge landlocked region in Central and West Africa, where all of these al-Qaeda-linked and ISIS-linked groups like Boko Haram were operating to such great effect. The headquarters for that multinational joint task force against Islamic extremism, again, those headquarters in Chad. And there's a reason there was so much international and regional military activity against Islamic extremists in that part of the world. They really had a toehold. By early 2015, Boko Haram was controlling territory in that part of Africa equivalent to the size of the nation of Belgium. Like, they had a lot of territory. And they were based in Nigeria, and Nigerian troops were fighting against them, but they couldn't do it on their own. And so that's part of why these regional efforts were set up to bring force to bear from multiple countries in the region. But there's a reason all of these regional and international groups were headquartered in Chad. Because all the experts say that pound for pound, that military from Chad and the Chadian special forces, they're the best, most battle-hardened, most experienced, most effective military for fighting Islamic extremism in that part of the world. In early 2015, when Boko Haram held that huge piece of territory in Nigeria, yeah, Nigerian troops fought them, but they brought in troops from Niger and from Chad, and together they kind of routed them. They ran them out of town after town after town. Boko Haram, by that point, had been proclaiming that they had formed a new Islamic emirate in that part of Africa. There's the Islamic Emirate in Iraq and Syria, and they were the other part of that. They were the other part of the caliphate, and they were setting up in that part of Western and Central Africa. But that regional military effort against them, led out of Chad, broke that stuff up, took back all those towns, shut them down. And Chad is not a rich country. They've got oil, so they've got a little bit of money, but they've also got a dictator who takes care of most of that. It's a large country. It's mostly poor. But for a variety of reasons, they have put profound resources into leading the military counter-terrorist fight in that part of the world. In March of this year, the United States led 27 countries in a massive military exercise in Chad. It was called Flintlock. 27 countries represented, exercise led by the United States. 2,000 U.S. military personnel participated in it. And again, they could have done this anywhere in Africa. There's a reason they did it in Chad. I mean, in this country, we tend to be more focused when we think about ISIS. We tend to focus on them more in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. But the other place they got pretty close to declaring a caliphate was in this part of the world. And it's all interlocking related groups. There's al-Qaeda-linked groups. There's Boko Haram. At least part of Boko Haram now calls itself a province of the Islamic State of ISIS. But for all of them, the lead military effort against them in that part of the world really has been the military of Chad. And it's interesting. Even though the Chad military has been leading the fight against these groups, there haven't actually been that many attacks by these groups inside Chad. And there's not a lot of Chadian civilians who have been joining the Islamic militant groups. Nigeria has a really big problem with them. Nigerian troops then go and fight these guys, and Chad comes too. Niger has a big problem with these guys. The troops from Niger fight these guys, and then Chad goes too. Mali has a big problem with these guys. Malian troops fight them, but then Chad goes too. It's not necessarily their homegrown problem. But Chad leads it. This has been much worse of a problem in their neighboring countries, but Chad has been tip of the spear. In Nigeria, in Mali, to a lesser extent in Niger, but Chad leads the fight. And all the regional efforts to fight the Islamic militants there, they're all headquartered in Chad, including the ones that we participate in. That kind of sort of military geospatial orientation usually doesn't matter to us here in the United States. But enter the Trump administration. September 24th this year, so 3.5 weeks ago, the Trump administration announced its new Muslim ban, which they would prefer you don't call a Muslim ban anymore. During the campaign, candidate Trump had proclaimed he would enforce a total and complete ban on Muslims entering the United States. That morphed into the Muslim ban that he announced as soon as he was inaugurated, which went precisely nowhere in the courts. It's gone through several different iterations since then, all of which have also gone nowhere in the courts. But on September 24th, they announced a new ban that included a new list of countries from which people would not be allowed to come to this country. And, I mean, it's random, right? So, or we don't know how this happens, but they dropped Iraq, okay? They dropped Sudan, but then they added in North Korea, they added in Venezuela, and they added in Chad. And the additions were weird. They were notably weird at the time. I mean, North Korea was a strange addition, not because North Korea isn't a country that the U.S. worries about right now. The reason North Korea was weird to turn up on the travel ban is because North Koreans don't really come to the United States anyway. It's not like North Koreans easily get passports, let alone visas. As for Venezuela, that one was pretty narrowly targeted. It targeted families of members of the government. So at least that one seemed to be aimed at something specific. But Chad, they just blanket banned people from Chad. Nobody from Chad can get a visa to come here anymore. And right from the get-go, there was this curious lack of explanation as to how Chad ended up on this list. The New York Times quickly reported that neither the State Department nor the Defense Department had been consulted by the Trump administration about putting Chad on the list. The Times further reported immediately that officials at both those agencies, both at State and Defense, were vehemently opposed to Chad being on this list. But for some reason, the Trump administration did it anyway. And what made it worse was the purported explanation for why Chad was on the list. Out of all of the countries listed in the current iteration of the travel ban, Chad's the only one that's described by the Trump administration as being on the list because, quote, several terrorist groups are active within Chad. Oh, yeah, that's the only country where that's happening. Right? I mean, maybe you could make that case that Chad has a terrorism problem. Certainly they've had some attacks. But they're not if that's the problem, they're not the problem. I mean, if that's the reason you end up on the travel ban list, even just in that part of the world, why wouldn't you pick Nigeria? Why wouldn't you pick Mali? I mean, broaden it out a little bit. Why wouldn't you pick Iraq? Why wouldn't you pick Afghanistan? No, Chad's the country that has terrorism? It's absolutely baffling. Absolutely baffling. And that is why you got all those quotes from the experts. Bewildering, puzzling, no reason, this makes no sense. The day after the travel ban was announced, the New York Times interviewed the man who had been the State Department's expert on that region until last year when we got rid of all the experts. He called putting Chad on that list, quote, a knee-jerk move rather than a careful decision, one that could put Americans in harm's way. He said there's no incentive to label Chad as soft on terrorism, which they definitely are not. Now, I want you just to stick a pin in one part of that quote there. This could put Americans in harm's way. You see that? That is the guy who used to be the State Department expert on Chad until last year. This decision could put Americans in harm's way. September 25th, he gave that warning. On Friday of last week, the government of Chad announced that they had completed the withdrawal of all Chadian troops from their neighboring country, Niger, where for years they have been fighting ISIS-linked Islamic militants as the most battle-hardened, most effective military in the region fighting Islamic militancy. The Reuters bureau in the region reported that already, immediately upon the withdrawal of those Chadian troops, Boko Haram attacks and other Islamic militant attacks started to tick up in Niger. Residents immediately started to leave their villages and move out of whatever region they lived in for their own safety because those Chadian troops withdrew from Niger. Chad announced that their troops were all out this past Friday, but they also announced that the removal of those troops was the culmination of a 2-week-long process. It took them 2 weeks to get all those troops out of there. The process was done by Friday, which means they started withdrawing their troops from Niger the last week in September. If we're going to be literal as to what they announced about the 2-week period, that means they pulled their troops out starting Friday, September 29th, which would be the Friday after the Trump administration made this baffling decision to insult and harm our closest military ally in that region and the leader of the regional fight against ISIS and Boko Haram in that part of the world where ISIS has been trying to establish another caliphate. And, you know, I'm sure the family members of those Chadian soldiers were happy to get them home when they all got suddenly withdrawn from Niger after America made this inexplicable decision about Chadian troops. But those Chadian troops were really doing something in Niger. They were protecting those villages in that whole region from ISIS and other Islamic militant groups being able to operate freely there and presumably to take more territory there once again. And those Chadian troops pulling out immediately had an effect of emboldening and enabling ISIS attacks. And those troops started pulling out, best as we can tell, last week of September, September 29th. This would be right after the Trump administration, inexplicably what they did. Those troops from Chad got pulled out the 29th. Well, right after that, that's when 4 U.S. Army soldiers got attacked by a large contingent of ISIS fighters in Niger. And 4 of them killed within days of the start of the Chadian soldiers being withdrawn. So no wonder the president doesn't want to talk about it, right? There had been some speculation that maybe the president didn't want to make any public acknowledgement of the deaths of those soldiers because he didn't want to talk about U.S. troops being killed by ISIS-affiliated fighters at a time when he wants to be given credit for defeating ISIS. That might be some of it. But this really was the deadliest combat mission of his presidency thus far. And it really did follow just days after a policy decision by his administration, an inexplicable, baffling, possibly mistaken policy decision by his administration. I mean, it's being called a mistake at best by everybody who knows the region. Just days after that policy decision by his administration, our best and most experienced and most battle-hardened regional military allies in that part of the world pulled out of that part of the world and went home, and then American soldiers were attacked. The AFRICOM spokesman from the U.S. military has said that the ambush that killed those 4 American soldiers was, quote, not expected. He said American troops had done more than 24 patrols in the same region over the last 6 months with no problem. But this one was different, certainly in its result, potentially in its cause. And now, today, in the 4th day of Washington turning itself inside out, over the president refusing to speak about the deaths of those service members and why they were killed and where they were killed and what they were doing there. Today, we finally got the first concrete information about why the Trump administration might have made that baffling decision in the first place that so upset this military ally of ours, that precipitated their withdrawal from the country where our troops were attacked just days later. I mean, there had been an initial speculation on this travel ban thing, and indeed, it was just speculation, that maybe this had something to do with Exxon. Chad's a poor country, but it does have oil reserves. ExxonMobil, more than anybody else, pumps their oil. The government of Chad had recently gone after Exxon, saying they'd been not paying their taxes. The country demanded something like $70 billion in fines from Exxon. On the tax issue, they wanted hundreds of millions of dollars from Exxon in overdue royalties. The government of Chad drove this very hard bargain with Exxon. They went after Exxon really hard. And yeah, the CEO of Exxon for most of this time was Rex Tillerson, and maybe that made him mad. That dispute between the government of Chad and Exxon was settled in June for some undisclosed sum. We don't know. But there had been speculation because of the weirdness of this decision about Chad, the lack of explanation for how this happened to Chad, that they ended up in the travel ban, that maybe this was some Exxon business revenge, some Exxon business decision that had leaked into the Rex Tillerson State Department. And I mean, for all the former State Department experts who've been speaking out about how bad and dumb and inexplicable this decision was toward Chad with the travel ban, Rex Tillerson himself has said nothing about it. And, you know, maybe someday we'll find out if that had anything to do with it. But today, the Associated Press reported something much more pedestrian that arguably makes it even worse because it's so stupid. When the Trump administration set about trying to develop a new travel ban, they told countries all over the world, all over the globe, hey, if you want to stay off our travel ban, you have to send the United States a simple passport. So the Homeland Security Department here can determine if your passport is secure. So we can determine if your passports are secure and they can't easily be faked. That was the across-the-board order from the Homeland Security Department. Hey, country that wants to stay off the travel ban list, we need you to print us up a new sample passport and send it to us. They gave countries a 50-day time limit to submit a freshly printed passport sample. In Chad, that turns out to have been a problem. Chad recently had to stop issuing passports altogether for about 6 months. Part of the problem appears to be an office supply problem. They use a special paper, like all countries do, to print their passports. Passports are secure documents. It often means there's a specially designed, supposed to be forgery-proof type of paper that's used to print these things up. Chad ran out of that paper. And at the time the U.S. was demanding these sample passports be submitted by every country on Earth, Chad was unable to print a new one because they didn't have the paper. According to the AP today, they asked the Trump administration if they could submit a recently printed passport from before the time they ran out of passport paper. The Trump administration apparently said no. And then apparently they ignored everything about our relationship with that country, including the fact that they are our most potent regional partner in fighting Islamic terrorism. And we headquarter all of our military efforts in that part of the world in their country because they work with us so well on that issue. They just ignored that, said they didn't get the paperwork in. And so Chad got on the list. And then that week, Chad said, we're pulling out of Niger. And now we are where we are. Like I said, if I were the president, I wouldn't want to talk about this either. What we've had instead is a 4-day-long, gut-wrenching fight and national discussion about something that should never be discussed in a political context, about the private treatment that military families receive from U.S. presidents when their loved one dies in service to the United States. And that culminated today in an incredibly emotional appearance in the briefing room from White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, who lost his son in Afghanistan. And with a quivering jaw, he walked the press corps through the path that the bodies of deceased service members take from the battlefield through U.S. military facilities in Europe, home to Dover Air Base, and then home to be interred. And he explained what he personally was told when he got the notification that his son had died in combat. And he attacked a congresswoman who had heard President Trump's call to a widow of one of the soldiers killed in Niger. He attacked her because the widow put the call on speakerphone and allowed that congresswoman and one of her own relatives to listen in. And it feels disgusting for us as Americans to have any of the private grief of these families or a president's handling or mishandling of it in public discussion at all, right? It's inconceivable that the president might have directed the public discussion of these private matters by his senior staff. But the only reason this subject matter is being discussed in any political context at all is because the president still will not talk about what happened in Niger and how and why those American troops lost their lives there. We knew from reporting in Politico last night that national security staff prepared the president a statement for him to give the day after the deaths happened in Niger. He didn't give that statement. He still hasn't. He still won't talk about it. And when he was pressed on it after 2 weeks of ignoring those deaths, the president diverted the public pressure on that matter into instead this discussion and these attacks about notifications and condolences for the bereft. The only reason that public discussion has happened now for 4 straight days, with all of the emotional strain it has caused to the country and caused to so many hurting people, is because of the president's diversion of questions about what happened in Niger. Well, now we're starting to figure out why he might not want to talk about that.